Okay, and welcome to video number 2. The subject of this week's activity is on how populations of living things, animals, plants, fungi, etc. change over time. So how do populations adapt to an ever-changing environment? And this is very important if you think back about the history of the Earth. All of you have probably heard of the Ice Age, among other things. That's just one example of the many different changes that the Earth has gone through over history that have to do with the changing climate and changing environmental conditions, and animals and plants and so on have to adapt to these changing environments, and if they didn't adapt to these changing environments they would become extinct. And so we're going to see some examples of that, and we look back at the history of their life. The dinosaurs obviously are the most famous example of that, and the ultimate cause of the destruction of the dinosaurs is still under some investigation and dispute, but there are many examples that we will take a look at. The main purpose of today's slideshow or today's video is to get you to think about some questions that biologists consider when going through trying to come up with an explanation for the observations that are found both in the fossil record and in the DNA of animals that exist today, and plants and other living things, and some of the puzzles that scientists try to solve by using observation and inference, as we've discussed before, those two being among the most important tools, mental tools, that scientists use. So we will take a look first at the first example is some food for thought. 65 million years ago, if you look back at the fossil record, there were no giraffes or elephants or lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. Why do you think that's so? How did they just suddenly appear if they weren't on Earth 65 million years ago? Did they just form out of thin air? Did they come from some other planet? How did they get here if they weren't here before? You can pause and think about that if you want. Hit the pause button and maybe write down some of your thoughts on that. I really would like for you in these videos to really grapple with the ideas that are presented and some of the problems that are presented to you. So the flip side of that comment, that there were no elephants, giraffes, etc. 65 million years ago, is that 65 million years ago there were dinosaurs, and they don't exist today. A little bit later than that, there were woolly mammoths on Earth, and they no longer exist. And saber-toothed tigers, you may have seen pictures of those. Giant insects, none of those things really exist anymore. I mean, there are some insects that are kind of big, but I wouldn't call them giants. You know, I mean, my Madagascan hissing cockroaches are kind of big, but they're not giants, not compared to some insects that existed in the past. So in what way might those two observations be related? Again, you might want to hit the pause button and think about that for a few seconds before you move on. How could those two observations, those two statements, is there any connection between those two? Pause. Okay. Now that you're back, let's take a look at some examples that are some interesting questions that we consider in biology and that you should be thinking about as we go through the year. This is a picture of a particular hummingbird. It has an extremely long beak, and you might wonder why a hummingbird would have such a long beak. And typically these hummingbirds live in a place where there's a food source that particularly long beak is very well matched to. Right? So we'll take a look at a closer view of the types of flowers that hummingbird likes to get nectar from. And you'll notice that these flowers have very, very long structures that the hummingbird has to insert its beak, or its bill, into the interior of that flower, and in doing so it gets nectar from the flower, and the pollen of the flower is up near the top. So while the hummingbird is trying to get the nectar from way down at the bottom, it's getting nectar all around its face, and then when it goes to the next flower it will transfer that nectar to the pistil or the stigma of another flower, thereby pollinating or fertilizing the flowers of another plant. And the interesting thing is, it's kind of obvious to us that the hummingbird, it's in the interest of the hummingbird over many generations to develop a long beak to be able to take advantage of these flowers. But the next question, though, is why is the flower? Why does the flower have this structure? And those two organisms, the flower and the hummingbird, it's interesting that they seem to be almost made for each other. It's not that the hummingbird just adapted to the flowers. Maybe it's the flowers that are adapting to the hummingbird as well, and so they're sort of influencing each other's development. All right, and we'll talk more about that at some other time, but just pause, if you will, and think about that for a moment. Try to make sense of it. The giraffes is a classic example of change over time, and the question has long puzzled scientists or given them examples of ways to try to explain what's going on, and the multiple multiple explanations that have been provided by scientists are very telling. We'll talk about those in class in some detail, but you can see here that the central question is what drives the giraffes to have a long neck. A lot of people think that it's because the giraffe eats plants and things that are way up high in the sky, and so it gets an advantage by being able to reach leaves that are high up in the tree that other animals can't reach, which is an important advantage that the giraffe would have over its competitors. And you'll see in the smaller one here that it's struggling a little bit to try to reach the leaves. And if you look at the bodies here, they're not necessarily different ages. They might be the same age. But this one with the long neck has an advantage over this one with the shorter neck. Okay. Another example is a little bit more mundane, if you will. These are all pictures of different types of pigeons, and these are all fancy pigeons that have been bred by humans. So they're not found in nature. You won't go out into the woods or into a forest and find a pigeon that looks like this. This is a man-made creation. And all of these, in fact, are man-made domesticated pigeons that have been brought about by selective breeding among pigeon fanciers. And all of these pigeons are descended from the same ancestor. They're all related to what's called the rock dove. This is a dove that lives out in the wild. And all of the rock doves have very similar colorations because there's a particular advantage to having this kind of coloration. It helps to camouflage them from the backgrounds in which they live. But when humans decide that they're going to breed these pigeons, then all sorts of things pop up in their eggs, for example, in the offspring, that provide offspring that look a little bit different than this or a lot different than this. And in nature, if these were the offspring in nature, they wouldn't live very long because they stand out. They stick out like a sore thumb, or these feathers on the feet clearly must be an impediment to movement if you're trying to run away from a predator or fly away fast from a predator. And so these guys just wouldn't survive in nature, but under the care of humans as pets, they're given protection and food and everything else, and so they thrive, and these weird variations are able to not only survive, but these are probably very very expensive and very sought after breeds of pigeons, and so there's an advantage in human captivity to having these unusual characteristics that humans like in animals that they keep as pets. Similarly, the dog, we can take a look at the different varieties of dogs that exist. Here we have everything from a huge Saint Bernard, the sort of regal-looking Afghan hound that's very famous, and all the way down to the Chinese crested, which is only about 12 inches long, the dachshund, which is only about 9 inches from the ground to the top of its head. And yet every single one of these unusual-looking dogs is the same species. None of these is found in nature. Not one of these dogs, there's no such thing as a wild Saint Bernard or a wild dachshund or a wild poodle. These are all, again, human creations, and they are all related to the wolf. They all descended from a wolf or a population of wolves that humans were able to domesticate, and then to start doing the same process of looking for variations in the offspring that had unusual characteristics, and then breeding those offspring that had the unusual characteristics, because that's the kind of characteristics that humans desired in the dogs that they were breeding. I'll show you later on an example of a video. You can look this one up if you want on YouTube, but I can't link to it because I'm at school. There's some experiments on taming foxes that sort of mimic or mirror the way we believe that humans were able to domesticate wolves many millennia, thousands of years ago. And the interesting way of looking at that is the question is kind of important is, well, how much of this involves humans actively taming wolves versus wolves, in a sense, taming humans, right? That there's this population of wolves out there. There's a small number of wolves found a way to sort of take advantage of humans' natural curiosity by insinuating themselves a little bit closer to human populations, and maybe they were over periods of time there were wolves that were not so aggressive and not so scary, and they were not so shy. So they would approach human populations, and maybe the humans would throw them scraps of food from the tables, or maybe it was just a matter of scavenging after the humans left. But they found a way to sort of to be able to get close to human populations where there was a food source that humans would have left behind, without scaring the humans so much that the humans' populations would have hunted them or killed them to keep them away from their campsites or from their villages or whatever. So there was clearly sort of almost a cooperative effort, a two-way street, that the wolf, the individuals that were in the wolf population that had certain traits allowed them to get closer to humans, and humans had this natural desire to make a connection with these animals, which a lot of us feel even today. We all have this desire to have a connection with animals. And so that worked to the advantage ultimately of both humans and the wolves. Okay, you can pause there for a moment if you want to stop and take notes. I know I've said a lot really fast, so if you feel like you need to stop and go back and review that, please do. And also, don't forget to write down questions. If anything I said doesn't make sense to you, pause, write down what it is I said that you don't make sense, and we'll go over it in class.